very, very, very disgraceful, I find their behaviour. Very disgraceful.
I think it's disgusting that they have not appeared or said a word relating to all this.
Well, I think it must be very, very cold-hearted not to have a flag up. I think it's a disgrace on the whole royal family.
I really am upset.
I can't understand the Queen doing it, really.
No.
Princess Anne thought it would be a routine visit, a final look through Princess Diana's preserved study before renovations began. But tucked inside a velvet-covered jewelry box, untouched for decades, she found something no one expected. A sapphire brooch and a handwritten note from Diana herself. What it said left Anne stunned and in tears. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a message, a plea, a warning about the crown, and a mother's desperate wish for her sons. What happened next shook the palace from the inside out and quietly changed Anne forever. You won't believe what she did next. The unexpected summons to Kensington. It started with a letter. A simple envelope, no royal crest, just Prince William's name written in his own hand. Inside was a quiet request for Princess Anne. He was asking her to come to Kensington Palace, not for an event, not for a family meeting, but to visit one room. A room that hadn't been touched in nearly 3 decades. Before the renovations, he wrote. Just that. No pressure. But Anne understood the weight behind it. She hadn't stepped inside Diana's private study since the late 1990s. The air in that space once held more tension than warmth. Anne and Diana had never been close. They were different in almost every way. Diana, emotional and open-hearted. Anne, duty-bound and sharp. But they had one thing in common. They both knew what it meant to survive the palace. Anne thought twice before saying yes. It felt unusual, even uncomfortable, but she saw it as an act of respect for William, and maybe, in some way, for Diana too. When she arrived, a staff member quietly led her down a familiar hallway. Nothing had changed. The same portraits, the same silence. Then they opened the door. It was like walking into a memory. Diana's study had been left almost exactly as it was. Light spilled in from the tall windows. A vase of silk flowers sat untouched. Books lined the shelves in soft pastels and deep navy. On a small table by the window sat a velvet-covered jewelry box, floral and unmistakably Diana's. Anne moved toward it slowly. She didn't expect much. Maybe a few old pieces of costume jewelry, a forgotten brooch. But when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside lay the sapphire and diamond brooch Diana had worn to a state banquet in 1983. It had been a gift from the Queen, meant to symbolize status and love. Anne stared at it. She remembered how the room had gone silent that night when Diana walked in wearing it. She owned the room without saying a word. But it wasn't the brooch that shook her. It was the faded paper taped underneath the lid of the box. A note, handwritten, dated July 1997. If Anne ever sees this, I hope she understands why I chose kindness. Anne's hands trembled. This wasn't about jewelry anymore. This was something else entirely. This was a message from Diana, and it had waited nearly 30 years to be found. A memory triggered by a sapphire brooch. The sapphire sparkled exactly as it had that night in 1983, but Anne couldn't stop staring at the note. Diana's handwriting was elegant, slightly rushed, but clear. If Anne ever sees this, I hope she understands why I chose kindness. The words hit her harder than she expected. Diana had been many things, adored, misunderstood, admired, but she had never been careless. If she left this note, she meant for it to be read. Anne picked up the brooch, her fingers brushing over the stones. She remembered the state banquet clearly. Diana had walked in wearing that piece like it was armor. And in a way, it was. That was one of the first nights Anne realized how powerful Diana had become, not through titles, but through presence. Anne sat down slowly. Her mind was racing. Why this piece? Why this note? Why her? As she looked again, another line came into focus, faded, but still legible. The crown takes everything. Don't let it take my boys. Anne froze. For a moment, all the rules, the years of silence, the things left unsaid, they all fell away. This wasn't about jewels or old memories anymore. This was Diana's last attempt to be heard. And Anne was finally listening. The note that reopened old wounds. The next morning, Anne returned to the palace alone. She needed to be sure it wasn't all a trick of the heart. But the note was still there, real, deliberate, and deeply personal. The rest of the message was short, just a few more lines. You were the only one who told the truth. You never pretended. Thank you for that. Please protect William if I cannot. Anne blinked hard. She had been honest with Diana, sometimes too honest. They had argued. Anne had criticized her decisions, her media games, even her emotional openness, but she had never hated her. In some strange way, she had respected her more than most. She remembered Diana once saying, "You care, but you hide it too well." Anne had shrugged it off at the time. Now, she wondered if Diana saw more than she let on. As she stood there in that silent room, Anne felt something crack inside her. Not guilt, not grief, just a deep, sharp regret. She had followed the rules. Diana had broken them. But now, all that was left were the boys, and the fear that maybe the system was breaking them too. Anne's private meeting with Charles. By the end of the week, Anne knew what she had to do. She asked for a private meeting with King Charles. No aides, no formality. He agreed. They met in a quiet room at Clarence's house, just the two of them. Anne placed the brooch on the table, then the note. Charles didn't say a word. He read it once. Then again, his face went pale. "She left you that?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Anne nodded. She didn't cry, but when she spoke, her voice cracked. She feared the machine would break her sons. It nearly did. Charles sat in silence for a long time. The past hung between them, heavy, unfinished. He finally looked up and said, "We all thought we had time." Anne told him things needed to change, not just for the public, but inside the family. She urged him to rethink William and Harry's roles, not just as heirs and spares, but as human beings. That night, palace insiders say, Charles quietly ordered a full review of upcoming royal strategies involving both sons. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a start. Conversations behind closed doors. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. Princess Anne held it in her hands as she stood outside the drawing room at Adelaide Cottage, where Prince William and Princess Catherine had just returned from a day of private engagements. It wasn't an official visit. There were no cameras, no staff briefings. This was personal. She hadn't told them she was bringing the note, Diana's note, the one written in 1997 and hidden beneath a velvet jewelry box for nearly 30 years. She wasn't sure how they'd take it, especially William. But after reading it again and again, there was no question in her mind he needed to see it. Inside, the room was quiet, warm with soft afternoon light. Catherine offered tea. Anne declined. She took a seat, pulled the note from her coat and placed it in front of William without a word. He hesitated, glancing at her. Then he unfolded the page. He read it once, then again, and then a third time, slower, his eyes fixed but blinking fast. He pressed the note against his chest and looked up. "Do you think she'd be proud?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Anne didn't hesitate. "She already was," she said softly. Catherine sat beside him, saying nothing, but the look in her eyes said more than any sentence could. It was a look of recognition, of shared pressure, of understanding what it means to stand tall inside a system that doesn't always allow space to breathe. There was no royal formality between the women in that moment. Just truth, just quiet empathy. Anne leaned forward, her tone low but certain. She told William the world still needed to hear Diana, not as a saint, not as a media icon, but as a woman, a mother, and a truth-teller whose voice had been too often silenced. "You don't have to make her a statue," Anne said. "Just don't let them erase her." William nodded slowly, as if something inside him had been unlocked. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was sacred. Three people, bound by blood and duty, trying to figure out how to carry a legacy that still echoed in every hallway of the palace. And then Anne did something no one expected. She went home that evening and sat at her desk. No assistant, no royal stationery, just a blank card and a pen. She wrote to Prince Harry. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't official. There were no titles used, no family formalities, just a quiet, heartfelt message from a woman who had finally seen the cost of silence and the damage of pride. She acknowledged the years of distance, the things unsaid, the hurt buried under protocol. She didn't ask for a reunion. She didn't plead for reconciliation. She simply told him, "Your mother loved you, and I should have said that more." She signed it, Anne. She didn't expect a reply, and she didn't need one, because for the first time in years, Anne stopped protecting the firm. And she started protecting the truth. Not the polished truth, not the official version, but the raw human truth Diana left behind. And in that quiet act, Anne didn't just honor a woman the crown once broke. She began to repair what it had forgotten to protect. The jewelry box's hidden compartments. Anne returned to Diana's study one final time before the renovations began. She told staff it was for closure, but even she knew that wasn't the full truth. There was something about the jewelry box she couldn't shake. Something that didn't sit right. It felt too heavy for its size, too deliberately placed. It was almost as if it had been waiting for her. This time, she came alone. No aides, no photographers, just silence and memory. The study smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a frozen fragment of a life once lived at full volume. Anne sat down beside the window, the same spot she'd found the box weeks earlier. She placed it on her lap, slowly ran her fingers along the base, every corner, every seam, and then, click. A small panel near the lower drawer gave way under the lightest pressure. Her instincts had been right. Behind it was a hidden compartment, no bigger than a notebook. Inside, a few sheets of yellowed folded paper, edges curled with time. Anne unfolded them gently. They were hand-drawn jewelry designs. Some were rough, others intricate. All of them unmistakably Diana's style. Underneath each sketch, her handwriting told the story. For cancer charities, inspired by the children at Great Ormond Street, jewels that give back. Anne blinked, overcome. These weren't just designs. They were dreams, a part of Diana's heart that had never reached the public. A plan never pitched, a vision never funded. A jewelry line meant to turn glamour into compassion. She held the sketches closer, as if by reading them long enough, she could hear Diana's voice. Then, underneath the papers, she found a small, unsealed envelope. Inside was a photograph, faded but clear. It showed Diana, Anne, and Queen Elizabeth standing together at a 1992 garden party. No stiff poses, no regal tension, just laughter. Genuine, unscripted laughter. Diana's arm was gently resting on Anne's. Anne's breath caught. She turned the photo over. On the back, written in blue ink, "We weren't close, but we were family. Please remember that." Anne stared at the message for a long time. She had always seen herself as the critic, the realist in a family built on fantasy. But in that single line, Diana reminded her that even amidst the distance there had been connection. Not perfection, not harmony, but something real. Anne leaned back in the chair, still holding the photo. It was the first time she'd seen herself through Diana's eyes, not as the stone-faced royal, but as someone who had mattered more than she ever realized. She didn't cry, not this time. When she rose to leave, she looked around the room once more. The furniture, the still air, the quiet elegance of a woman gone too soon. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't need to. The box was shut, but its message was wide open. What Diana had hidden wasn't just jewelry. It was truth, intention, and legacy waiting to be passed on. And now, it belonged to Anne. Anne's speech at a military ceremony. 2 weeks later, under a soft gray sky in Portsmouth, Princess Anne stepped up to the podium at a Royal Navy dedication, a ceremony she had attended countless times before. The uniforms, the salutes, the carefully measured words, it was familiar ground. Anne had always done her duty here without drawing attention, her speeches brief, crisp, and by the book. But this day felt different. She looked out at the crowd, not just at the officers and veterans, but at the quiet strength in the faces of their families. Wives, husbands, children standing in the drizzle, waiting to hear something that sounded like understanding. Anne adjusted the microphone. Her speech was typed and prepared, but she looked down only once before folding the paper and setting it aside. And then she said it. Some serve with medals, others serve without ever being saluted. Just one line, but it echoed through the silence like a cannon. The crowd went still. For a split second, no one moved, no one clapped, because no one expected it, not from her. Anne, the famously no-nonsense royal, had suddenly stepped out from behind the shield of protocol and spoken straight from the heart. The impact was immediate. By evening, every major outlet had picked up the quote. It led the BBC's coverage. Social media exploded. One commentator called it a line for the history books, and maybe the most honest thing ever said by a senior royal. Anne didn't give interviews. She didn't clarify. She didn't need to. That sentence said more than 1,000 press releases. Royal watchers were stunned. The same woman once nicknamed her royal toughness had just shown the kind of softness no one had ever seen in public, and done it on her own terms. Behind the scenes, Prince William approached her quietly after the ceremony. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just hugged her, something rare between them, and whispered, "That was the bravest moment I've seen in years." Anne didn't respond with words, but her eyes, slightly glassy, fiercely steady, said it all. Something inside her had shifted. She hadn't stepped away from her duty, but now she was performing it differently, not with armor, but with empathy. And for the first time, the world didn't just see her as the Princess Royal. They saw her as something deeper. A woman unafraid to speak truth in a room built on silence. A bridge between tradition and transformation. The voice Diana might have needed, finally speaking. The diary. Anne never expected. It came quietly, as most life-altering things do. Just a few days after Anne's symbolic appearances, wearing Diana's sapphire pin, an unexpected call came through. It was from one of Diana's former private secretaries, long retired, long silent. He had something he believed Anne should see, something that had been kept safe, untouched, for nearly 3 decades. A single page from Diana's diary. Anne hesitated. Her heart had only just started to settle after the jewelry box, the brooch, the photo. Every time she thought the past had said all it could, it opened its mouth again. But still, she said yes. He arrived without fanfare, handed over a small envelope, and left without another word. Inside was one torn diary page, fragile, slightly faded, written in Diana's unmistakable hand. Anne sat alone in her private sitting room and unfolded it with care. She read the first line. Anne knew the rules, Diana had written, but she also knew the cost. I hope she forgives me for breaking both. Anne didn't breathe for a moment. The words hit like thunder. There was no bitterness, no flattery, no apology, just truth. Raw, simple, human truth from a woman who knew her time was running out. Anne read the passage again, then again. Every word painted a clearer picture, not of rivalry or resentment, but of mutual recognition. Diana had seen Anne, understood her silence, understood the weight she carried behind her discipline. Diana didn't ask for understanding. She only hoped for forgiveness. And that, more than anything, broke something inside Anne. Palace staff say they hadn't seen her for hours that afternoon. When someone finally checked in, they found her sitting exactly where she had started, her eyes red, the diary page still in her hands. She wasn't speaking. She wasn't moving. Just sitting there, holding a truth too heavy to put down. Later that night, she sent for William. She didn't explain over the phone, just asked him to come. When he arrived, she handed him the page. He read it slowly, his face unreadable. Anne looked at him and finally spoke. She wasn't weak. She was too strong for that place. That moment shifted something between them, not as royal siblings, not even as a future king and his aunt, but as two survivors of a system that doesn't always make space for grace. For the first time, Anne wasn't just remembering Diana. She was finally understanding her. A private gesture becomes public. In the weeks that followed, something subtle but deeply symbolic began to unfold. At first, it went unnoticed. Princess Anne, the ever-practical royal, showed up to a veterans' hospital visit in Scotland wearing a small sapphire pin. It sat quietly on her lapel, gleaming just enough to catch the light. No press release mentioned it. No royal stylist explained it. But those who pay attention, the royal watchers, the lifelong Diana supporters, saw it instantly. That pin wasn't from the royal collection, it was Diana's. It wasn't large, it wasn't flashy. There were no diamonds flanking it, no statement design. It was simple, elegant, The kind of piece Diana wore when she wanted to send a message without saying a word. And now, Anne was wearing it. She wore it again the following week at a military presentation, then again at a women's charity luncheon, always quiet, always visible. Reporters began asking questions. Where was the pin from? Was there significance? Anne said nothing. She offered no explanation, no comment. But her silence was louder than any headline. This wasn't a fashion choice. This was memory, worn on the outside. The public responded faster than anyone inside the palace expected. Social media lit up with speculation and admiration. Hashtags trended overnight. As our Diana spin, Anne remembers as our silent tribute. People called it Anne's unspoken apology, a bridge to the past, and, most powerfully, the tribute Diana never got while she was alive. Newspapers that rarely gave Anne front-page space now ran headlines like, "The Crown's Quiet Conscience." Anne steps into the light with Diana's truth. But behind palace walls, not everyone was celebrating. According to close sources, Queen Camilla was quietly unsettled. She'd worked hard to solidify her role beside Charles, carefully rebuilding public favor after decades of controversy. Now, suddenly, Diana's name and her memory was rising again. And this time, it wasn't through tabloids or documentaries, it was through Anne. Camilla didn't say anything publicly. She maintained her usual composure. But insiders noted a tension in briefings, a shift in how engagements were scheduled, a growing unease about Anne's sudden media glow. But Anne didn't flinch. She wasn't doing this for attention. She wasn't rewriting history. She was simply letting a small truth live in the open. For once, she wasn't just upholding the monarchy. She was protecting a woman the monarchy couldn't protect. And the public, the people who had once viewed Anne as cold, distant, unreachable, saw her now through different eyes. She was still the iron-spined royal, but now she was something else too, a protector of memory, a keeper of legacy, a silent witness who finally chose to speak, with no words at all. What Anne now believes about the future. By early 2026, Anne had stopped pretending things would go back to the way they were. She met with William again, this time at Sandringham. Just the two of them. They spoke for hours about Diana, about the monarchy, about the pressure that comes from being born into a system that doesn't always feel human. Anne said something that stayed with him.
Diana wanted change. We all saw it coming. None of us were brave enough to follow.
Then she looked at him carefully and added, "Protect your authenticity and protect Catherine's emotional clarity. That's your anchor." Not long after, Anne quietly began supporting modernization efforts behind the scenes. She challenged old customs, pushed back against advisors she once agreed with, and even turned down a traditional royal honor, saying it represented outdated symbolism. The message was clear. Anne hadn't abandoned duty, she had redefined it. Her legacy was no longer just about service and silence. It was now about conscience, about truth, and about the quiet strength of a woman who finally chose to feel everything she had once been told to hide. And somewhere, if you believe in such things, Diana was watching.
And maybe, just maybe, she was smiling.
One jewelry box, one note, and a legacy too powerful to stay buried. Anne walked into that room out of duty, but left with Diana's truth in her hands. And now, with the world watching, she's carrying it forward. Not for the crown, but for the woman it couldn't protect.